So now that we have our instrument selected and our MIDI into GarageBand, and also obviously our default information gone, we can start playing around with the MIDI itself. So if we go double click on here again, it'll open up the piano roll for this part of the lesson. One of the first things I wanted to demonstrate within the piano roll is the control of dynamics, which is done in several ways, but I wanted to show the principal way of doing it, especially for piano instruments and usually non-sustained instruments. By that I mean, obviously the piano, while it does have a decent sustain, is it's sort of more release time rather than a sustain in terms of like the air of or the lung power of a brass or woodwind player, or the bow length of a violin or cello or whatever. They obviously have as much sustain as they do have air in their lungs or the amount of bow. Whereas the piano, obviously, once the string is struck, it depends on how long that string will stay vibrating as to whether or several strings, because the upper register of a piano has several strings. How long those strings vibrate will obviously be the length of time by which the instrument is producing a sound, and even then they might be vibrating so gently that they're almost inaudible. So for that reason, obviously pianos can't generate a sort of dynamic increase, so like a crescendo through their notes. They have to do it progressively over several notes, and that for that reason pianos are limited to velocity as a mean, well, at least in MIDI orchestration, velocity as a means of controlling dynamics. So it's probably worth actually opening the score, which I have provided along with the MIDI files, and they can be found, obviously, well, as I said, with the MIDI file, and it should be the PDF. So if you double click on that, it should open it. Locate it where you've saved it, and then we can drag this open. You don't really need to be able to read the music, although I think it would be helpful if you can sort of understand some of the symbols on here. So double forte here means fortissimo, and that is the marking for very loud. Here's a crescendo. So these are all dynamic markings. So dynamic instructions are basically the volume at which you play. Obviously you'll strike the keys with more force to produce a greater fortissimo here. And then we have piano here, which means quiet, and pianissimo, which is even quieter. And then crescendo, and a hairpin here, which is also an additional means of demonstrating crescendos, or instructing a crescendo rather. So I have deliberately left this piano marking out, meaning at bar 5, rather than dropping down to piano, the previous fortissimo carries on, meaning we obviously have to change the dynamics manually, the velocities manually. So if I just play it now, so that was bar 4 going into bar 5, and there was no change. So to create a change, what we need to do is, I've just increased the space there so it's a bit easier to see, is go to the automation, and then go down to here where panning's open, because that was the last thing I changed, and we want to go to note velocities. And then, having done that, what we need to do is simply select, sorry for the noise, I should have muted that, I always forget to do that, so be warned for future lessons. And then we need to just drop this down I'd recommend about 60, because it doesn't want to be as low as this pianissimo. Could go a bit louder than that actually, but it obviously wants to be far lower than the fortissimo. We want a nice big change between the dynamics there. As we can see here, because this is all the velocities, we have the fortissimo here, and then the crescendo, and then it drops down. So obviously Sibelius puts in some of the stuff for us, but we need to do this bit manually because, as I say, I programmed it so it wouldn't put it in. The other thing I also did was incorrectly input the crescendo, so that we have to do another means of applying velocities, a slightly different technique, because obviously this isn't just sort of a blanket technique. This is a gradual increase over several notes in volume or dynamic. So to do this, what we need to do, well, it's actually a bit simpler. Go down to our velocities here, and then by pressing Command and holding Command, this pencil marker will come up. We simply draw a line to create the shape of the dynamics that we want. So that's done that for me, which isn't actually too bad. Sometimes it can jump depending on the line and your starting point and end points. So that's not too bad. It's a decent mark here. Might increase this set of notes a bit. Oh, and bring that one down. That's another thing we can do. We can obviously grab individual notes in here. It is a bit more difficult with the piano because there are several notes. So if you want to change individual notes to sort of tweak, but you have a specific one in mind, then another way of changing dynamics is simply to click on a note, and then it should be on notes here rather than region. Then we can simply pull it up. Obviously we don't want it that loud, or pull it down. We don't want it that quiet. Sort of want it about there, somewhere in there. Although we're going to cover that in the next lesson anyway, but that's just in case you want to tweak some of the dynamics now. So obviously I suggest putting in these dynamics. And we should probably, actually I should have probably tested this before moving on. But what we should have then, and I'll probably play from this bar here 4 and right through. And we should hear, well actually I'll play it all the way through now. We should hear the crescendo, even if it's not too major. And then the sudden drop down to piano, and then another drop down to pianissimo, and then the crescendo at the end to the mezzo forte kind of region, which has been applied here. We might want to increase that. It has got an accent underneath, but I don't think it certainly wants to be as loud as fortissimo. So let's have a listen. Okay, so the dynamics are in there now, and that's quite effective as it is, so I don't know if I'd necessarily tweak them, at least in line of the sort of dynamic changes. I won't tweak them too much more. Maybe I would want to go a bit bolder at the end, but I'm going to leave it for now. Hopefully, through listening there, you could hear not only a volume shift within the music, so like here when it got really loud, you didn't hear the same sort of piano sound when the dynamic dropped, and that's because sample instruments have multiple samples on each note, or at least the better the sample instrument, the more samples they have on each pitch on the keyboard. well, even some sample libraries actually don't even have one pitch per key, and sometimes they use pitch shift techniques to sort of use one note. Say if it was this C here, this C might also be the sample here for this C might also be the same for the B below, B flat A, or even the notes above, although I've heard generally they go downwards because pitching down seems to work better than pitching up, sound more natural. However, generally the better the piano sample, or any sample for that matter, the better the sample instrument, the more layers it'll have, and the more samples it'll have loaded into it. However, one thing that they do to create a better dynamic response and a more realistic dynamic response is to have multiple samples loaded into per pitch. So a good way of demonstrating this would be if I do something like this. And then I go right down to 1, which will barely be audible. Go up in 30s. 60. 90. I was going up in 30s then. 90 and then 120. I will put one last one in. But max it out because it's between 1 and 127. And obviously 1 is the lowest value, it's quieter. But hopefully through this we'll hear not only the change of volume, but there'll be a sample change. So that we'll hear the effect of the piano getting louder, because obviously it doesn't sound the same. It has a sort of subtle timbral changes, and timbre being the sort of sound quality of the instrument. So what defines a piano as being a piano is its timbre, sort of. There's probably more psychoacoustic sort of properties, I think, that are linked, but we'll not go into them. But hopefully we should hear the change in not only volume, because this is a volume controller as well. It sort of affects the volume of the sample itself, but it also, depending on what band it falls within, will affect the sample that's being triggered. So let's have a listen. So with that, there are ways in which we could have a look at inside the sample, although I don't think it's possible in GarageBand, and I'm not going to do it anyway. We could certainly hear a change between these two. So it's slightly more muffled, as though the softness of the depression of the key sort of lent the hammer onto the string, if we sort of picture that. Sort of lands on it gently and it sort of rings out a bit more slowly, so there's less attack on the note. Whereas when we get to, what note's this, 60? Okay, that's similar as well. So I'd probably say there's at least 3 samples in here on this one note. And then we get to this one, which is on 90, and the attack starts to build up. Because obviously the player is depressing the key of the piano more rapidly. And velocity is essentially another word for speed, I guess. It creates a bigger attack, which in turn should affect the sustain, because the harder the strings are vibrating, the longer they will vibrate for, because they have to gradually slow down. So that is velocities, and how to apply them into the music, and how they sort of, well, an introduction of how they work in terms of sample instruments.